Anti coba bercakap. Anti coba bercakap.
Nasi lemak.
Oh, boleh.
Boleh.
Oh, tadi tidak dengar.
Tidak.
Oh, oke. Wah, Angie, sedapnya.
Hey, if I need to record, let all record thank you video to Jane. Ya, tapi session. Bila kamu lepas habis, dalam discussion.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Elsie.
Good morning, everyone. Morning, Michelle.
It's always nice to see your faces this early in the morning for me.
Three of us. Wow.
Nice to see you too.
Very
When I see you, not a thing that I would say. 'Cause you're amazing, just the way you are.
Wow. You guys just harmonized.
Yeah. Beautiful.
I feel like, yeah. I'm like, was that totally spontaneous? Because you're all very gifted.
Yeah.
That was amazing.
I love the color of your hair.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really fun. I was actually a little bit nervous. I was like, I don't know if that's going to be unusual for Malaysia or if it's cool. I don't know.
But not for our church, just a bit still old fashioned.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of always the question mark is
Yes.
if you're speaking in churches and stuff. I've gotten a little used to the YWAM context. I'm very free.
Good, good. Yeah.
Hello, Rufus.
Morning, Rufus.
morning.
Rufus, are you in, remind me where you are right now. Are you in Malaysia?
Singapore.
Singapore, that's right. Okay, so you and Grace are both in Singapore. And Elsie, you're not in Singapore?
No. I'm in Malaysia, but in north, on the east side of Malaysia, Sabah.
Okay. Yeah. Is that where you're from?
No. I'm from KL.
Okay. Oh, Kuala Lumpur. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good morning. I think before we start, yeah, or Christy, or we don't know, maybe she coming later. Elsie, can you pray for our class this morning?
Okay. Thank you. Father, thank you, Father, for this wonderful day, wonderful morning, Father. Just commit this day into your hand, Father God. I pray that you continue to give us the insight, the revelation, the wisdom and understanding to understand today's study, Father. I pray, Father, that you bless Michelle as she continue to teach us, Father. May you continue to give her the strength, the alertness and all, Father God, and revelation from you. And also, I pray, Father God, that you will continue to minister to each and every one of us through your word, Father. Thank you so much, Father. We just commit this day and all the media, everything will work properly too, Father God. We just want to thank you, Lord. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Elsie.
Welcome.
Thank you, Elsie. Okay, so we left off looking at David and Bathsheba and the birth of Solomon yesterday. And we're going to wrap up 2 Samuel in this hour, but I do want to kind of give some time to questions. I think it seemed like there were some questions also around, potentially around Samuel and Saul when he seeks from a medium. So I just want to give room for you guys. If there's anything at all throughout the text that's coming up for you, or that you've been thinking you have questions about so far. So maybe let's start with the classroom. You guys are all doing good. You feeling good about it? Wow. All right. Okay. And then anything from Elsie or Rufus?
Mm,
I
my
got a
yesterday.
question.
Oh, sorry. You go
Okay,
ahead.
I'll see you on answer first.
You wanna go ahead?
Okay. Actually, my one goes all the way back to First Samuel. Sorry, I'll be slow. Um, okay, so you see this period where Israel has all these judges, and then after that, they ask for a king, but the judges is already counted as a ruler of the Israelite people, right? Why suddenly they ask for king instead of like raise up another judge? Like I believe the word that they use king is different, right? Even in the original text. So why?
Okay, so going back to looking at like Israel's sin in wanting a king, and why didn't they ask for a judge? So at that point, they had Samuel as a judge, and Samuel was appointing his sons in the text. So the nation claims, right? So the leader, it wasn't the nations, the leader, so leader of each tribe essentially was coming together and having this discussion, and then saying the sons of Samuel are unfit. We can't, like, there's no one else. We need a king. So your question is that is the sin, the very thing you're asking. Why wouldn't they, seek God, ask for something within his system that he's already given them and created for them? That's the ultimate question, actually. That's how we kind of look at them and say, okay, well, this was a sin. They weren't looking and thinking about it in the context of Levitical law, in the context of what God had asked them to think like. They were in fear, really. They were in fear of the nations around them and the grid that they had for what politics looked like apart from their own nation was a king, was a monarch. And that's all they saw. So in essence, God's trying to make a monarch with him as the king, but that looks completely different from the rest of the nations, and they don't see that within themselves. They're not understanding any longer, if they ever did understand truly, what God is trying to do. And the sin is that they're afraid of man and not trusting God, enough to the point to where they're saying, we want a monarch that looks like everything around us, and rejecting God's true understanding of government.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure.
My yesterday's question was is about David's sin, with Bathsheba. But he repented from his sin. Just that, but you said that there's consequences and also effects of his sin, you see, to his sons, right? Because they started to kill one another, because of David's sin. But I thought God has already forgiven him. How come the consequences still affects the family members?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So something to keep in mind is we get kind of two images throughout the book, right? We get, well, I wouldn't say images. Yeah, images or storylines. We get man's sin on earth, right? And the effect of that sin, and then the consequence of that sin. And then you have God, who is, it's basically free will and then God's preeminence, right? So you have God who steps in his preeminence, and he uses, essentially often he uses man in the midst of their sin, right? To teach, to show the people, to renew covenant, to talk and show about the promise of a savior, all those elements. But he's not necessarily, it's quite hectic actually to explain. He's not, I wouldn't say that he's necessarily, the forgiveness that he gives for a specific sin is going to cover all of man's sin at this point. This is pre-Jesus. So how God is working with man is going to look different. So he's forgiven, the question of forgiving David's sin already just between David and God looks different, because he's not saying there's no punishment or consequence, right? But just because he forgives him. So there's something separate there. But what he's done is he's graciously lightened the consequence, specifically on David. David deserves death. He's not going to die, right? But then because of his actions and the effect of those actions, that God's not intervening with mankind's effect and the consequence of sin. And that is what carries on. So there's also other elements that we don't necessarily see specifically in the text, but to think about David as a father, right? So when we haven't talked about Amnon and Tamar yet, or Absalom yet, but when we start to see the sin and their choices, it's very evident that potentially they're missing, a father character in their lives to an extent, because David is a king ruling over a nation. Okay, and there's not really any excuse necessarily, but we can see by their choices, they don't understand who God is. And we do see also separation from his sons. And culturally, being the sons of a king, you wouldn't have been raised closely or intimately by the king. You would have been raised more by your mother. And these mothers weren't necessarily all practicing believers of Yahweh 100%, right? So when we look at the continuation of sin, and that God says the sword will be in your house forever, and the consequence of that, it's not just this one sin specifically, and God has mandated that people will pay for it. It's the consequence of earthly sin. It's the outcome to David's choices and his wife's choices, right? And the parenting choices and everything that's also, it's also nature. It's also what's influenced these men. And we just basically pick up the stories, right? Right as those sins happen, and then we see how God steps in. So we just kind of have to remember that separation. Does that help?
Yes. Thank you so much. Because
Yeah.
I see continuous things happening like this.
Yes.
Even David, with the census, that was another.
Yes.
Yeah. The people of Israel have to suffer for what David did.
Yeah, the sin of the census is actually a bit of a confusing,
Yeah, I know.
a confusing story as well. Yeah, essentially, the overall theme of what you're saying is that, yeah, there is consequence to sin in the earth because of its effects and how it affects mankind and then mankind's decision. And we basically get these intimate scenes, and then we get kind of zoom out how it's affecting the nation as a whole. And then it just kind of goes back and forth. But it's good. That's good observation as well. Okay, is there any other questions from anyone before we move on?
Can I also add that, Michelle, on top of what you say?
Yeah.
Just because Jesus forgiven our sin doesn't mean that we are not accountable of the consequences of our sins right now, right? Like even if you kill someone, there's punishment, there's consequences. Yes, we repent and Jesus forgave us, but that doesn't undo what you've done, right? Like you still have to go for your punishment for killing someone, for committed a crime. So there are still the effect of sins and consequences of what we're doing. But God can and will sometimes intervene, but not all the time, just like Michelle said. God definitely has the power. Doesn't mean that He will do it every time, but there are still consequences of all our choices because God gave us a free will and can do that. But that doesn't mean that what we've done cannot be we're still living the consequences, but God forgiven our sin doesn't mean that it's going to erase everything.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Grace. Yeah, I like how you said that. Okay, sorry, can I just get the screen sharing?
Yep.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna pick up looking at Amnon and Tamar. So this is Amnon. This is the firstborn to David, and essentially he's going to pursue his half sister. Okay, and this is considered this is illegal. It's against the law. It should be at this point. And it's considered incest. It's not something accepted in the cultural practice. Okay, so looking at Amnon's character a little bit in this story, Amnon mistakes lust for love, and potentially finding excuse by the actions of others around him. He allows himself to be reasoned by bad counsel, by Jonadab, and plots with Jonadab then how to get what he wants from his sister, take his sister in secret. It's interesting the way the text talks about Amnon as being sick. And it's kind of this air to like a mental illness. The way that he cannot stop thinking about his sister. And so there is an alluding there of an adult male who's basically choosing to partake in cultural sexual practices, now being somebody who's really driven by lust to a super extent because of that. And who is the counselors around him and the friends that he keeps lets him do what he wants. Okay, so there's very little understanding of Yahweh. We don't see Yahweh in this picture anywhere. There's no voice of God anywhere at this point in the household of David. Okay, and we can conclude that Amnon is not thinking past his immediate sexual desire or effect or aftermath, right? That's not his mindset and his desire. Okay, selfishness is inherently connected to sin. So in the end, what's driving Amnon is nothing but self-indulgence and what he wants. Okay, we're going to look at Tamar and come back to that. Okay, so the law on sexual relationships, none shall approach any one of his close relatives and uncover nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, your mother's daughter, whether brought up in the family or in another home. Okay, so the story is that Amnon's going to, in secret, collude and plot to get Tamar to bake for him. He's sick. The situation is accepted. David actually approves that Tamar would run to Amnon. The text does not tell us if David really understood Amnon's intentions or if he knew them. By the way David responds, it doesn't seem so. But David himself, we have to remember, we don't really, besides the situation with Bathsheba, we don't really see him in his life cutting off himself from his own lust and issues with women. Okay, so again, we kind of have to look at this as a divided understanding of personal versus ruling a nation versus relationship with God. So Tamar is sent to him and she's obedient to him. And then we walk into this situation where he's actually going to take advantage of her. So I'm going to read I'm just going to read her response in the midst of the situation. I'm going to start at verse 11. So it's chapter 13, verse 11. It says, "But when she brought them near to him, the food, he took hold of her and said to her, 'Come, lie with me, my sister.' She answered him, 'No, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing.' As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. But he would not listen to her. Okay, so looking at Tamar's plea, there's a few things in historical background that we can pick up, okay? The first thing that she responds with is going to be in response to whether or not it's okay to take brides by force in Israel custom at the time. So other nations would be able to kidnap women or approach and assault women in order to claim them. Okay, Israel did not agree with this. It's in their Levitical law. It's not something they were allowed to do. So when the first reproach she makes, this thing is an outrageous thing of fools. It's an abomination. Okay, she's basically pleading and saying, our culture doesn't do this. Now, it doesn't mean no one in Israel did it. Okay, but it shows a bit of Tamar, an understanding of what was right and wrong under the cultural law at the time. Okay, the second thing that she's going to approach is her personal honor. How could I carry my shame? Okay, she's a virgin, so this is ultimate, violation, and she would be disgraced in the nation, and she would not be able to marry. She would not, potentially, she wouldn't be able to, be given in marriage for any sort of political reason by David. And this would have meant identity. This would have meant a life of being taken care of or provided for. So the context there is a little bit different than what we understand and have rights to do as women today. Okay, the third thing she responds with is her concern for Amnon. Okay, she realizes that without witnesses, there can be no judgment. So she tells him that he will be counted among the fools, a term that applies to men without principle or personal honor who come to a bad end. Okay, so even though she potentially may realize that there's no witnesses around, there's no one to concede that he did this to her, she still basically responds in a way that's trying to frighten him, that's trying to, again, show him the right and wrong of the situation. Okay, and then when that doesn't work, she's then suggesting her willingness to join Amnon as his wife. Okay, so the very last thing that can be done in order to save her life, so to speak, culturally at this time, is then to talk to the king. He will not keep me from you, which is, we're not sure if that's true, so we don't want to necessarily say that David was okay with incest at this time, as much as this is the midst of a struggle. But the plea there would have been understood. Okay, Amnon's not going to do any of these things, and he violates her, and then he says that the text says he hated her with a very great hatred, so much hatred that which he hated her was greater than the love in which he had loved her. And he said to her, get up and go. Okay, so just looking at that response specifically as well, it can allude to some shame and disgust in violation of his sister. Though he doesn't seem to care about the law, he doesn't seem to care about her pleas, or his mindset, again, is lust driven. There's this specific guilt, I think, that this shows us in the text. It doesn't mean that he's convicted. I'm not gonna say that. But thinking about it from a perspective of hating with a hatred of disgust, kind of in the Hebrew terminology. It's what he feels for himself and then projects onto her. Okay, so Tamar's fate. So if we look at this kind of from a judge and jury perspective, okay, taking on some Hebrew thought and some Hebrew law. Okay, Tamar's fate. Because she was no longer a virgin, her worth and her household was diminished, and she quite possibly would never marry. There could be no contracted marriage for her. This would be if David was giving her, away as a bride in another nation. It suggested in the comment that she came under the care of Absalom's household rather than David's. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting thing. David didn't keep her and protect her. Absalom did. And it kind of, also just backs up the idea that she would have lived an unfulfilled life. Okay, so that's kind of funny wording, but for the culture at that time, that really speaks to marriage being, again, something that provided for you, gave you reason, having children, and she's a young woman, right? So in her mind, this is devastating. Okay, and essentially politically, it's devastating to David as well, because he no longer has a daughter that he can betroth. Okay, not looking at the ethics of that, but just that was a cultural practice at the time. That was something that gave him ability politically, and now he's not going to have one of his daughters for that purpose. Okay, so looking at legalities in Hebrew culture, okay, the punishment for sleeping with your sister. If a man takes his sister, a daughter of his father or a daughter of his mother, and sees her nakedness, and she sees his nakedness, it's a disgrace. And they shall be cut off in the sight of the children of their people. He has uncovered his sister's nakedness, and he shall bear his iniquity. Okay, this speaks of excommunication. Okay, so this would essentially, the outcome would be that he's stripped of his title, his role, his position, any ability that he has to be the next king, and sent out into excommunicated territories, basically outside of Israel. Okay, but it doesn't quite fit the extremity of the mold here. There seems to be, like in this specific situation, it would be both are accepting kind of in their ancestral state. It's not speaking of a violation necessarily. Okay, so then the second option, if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense, punishable by death. For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering, because his neighbor, okay, so just cut off there, but because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried out for help, there was no one to rescue her. Okay, so now this is punishable by death, but this doesn't necessarily speak to incest as well. And it definitely speaks to the violation, but then it's also not necessarily, Tamar is not necessarily betrothed, okay? Contextually, you could consider her betrothed, perhaps, because of her being a king's daughter and what that meant politically, but she's not actually betrothed at this time. So again, it's a bit like, does it fit the mold, doesn't it? Okay, the third option, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to her father, the father of the young woman, 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, for he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. Okay, so with the third option, some things to pick up from this law of consequence. The idea of payment should have equated to the value of life. Okay, so there's two things here. It seems like a bit of a light punishment for a violation. Well, in my society today, we would say this is a light punishment for a violation. But we need to think in their context. So, essentially, there's two things happening. One is that the money and the payment is equating to the value of human life. So the lesson is that you have taken something precious, okay, and its worth and its value is great. And the price there is no little price in their amount of worth and money. Okay, so you now owe this family, not because you're buying the person, but an equate of human value in life and its worth in that context. Okay. And then the second thing is that he must marry her and he can never divorce her. So what that speaks to is not just you need to marry this woman and then she's just in your household and she's there, right? This speaks to actually having to take care of this woman. You, again, the wife would, her inheritance is in family, her inheritance is in the husband, right? So now this woman is not a concubine, she's not a woman on the side, she's not, and she is your wife, the highest of standard, value, and respect, with the most rights at that time that a woman could have. Okay, so that speaks to relationship again there, and how he would have to treat her. And then there is no suggestion of divorce. This is now your life. You must take care of what you have done, and what you have sown for yourself. So what punishment would you sentence Amnon? So I want you to just take a minute with the person next to you. Think about this from a judicial perspective or just a justice perspective, okay? Try to think in Hebrew law with what we're talking about. What does Amnon deserve? Where do you think he falls in line with one of these consequences? And then for the online guys, if you want to utilize the chat room, you can. Cool. Okay, let's come back together. And then let me hear from someone. What did you think in the classroom? What were some decisions?
The punishment will be death for us.
Okay. So the second consequence listed.
Yeah. So I think I deserve deserve 1 and 3, the punishment, the legal punishment for sleeping with your sister, and the punishment for violating your virgin, through the king, like king itself, the decision through the king, the father.
Okay, so is it one group or table says 1 and 3, and then another group says 2?
Yes.
Is that the? Okay. All right, Elsie, Rufus, what do you guys think?
The thing is, we are debating between 1 and 2. I mean 1 and 3. But it seems that one, there is a higher breach of trust because not only is she a virgin, but it's his sister also. So there is that even higher level of trust that has been breached by Amnon. So exile for both of them, I guess. Even though Tamar not really to blame, but on the law is the law.
Yeah. Elsie, was that also kind of what you were? Sorry, I didn't catch that. You guys said that together. Okay. Yeah. So it's a bit tricky because I like what you're saying, Rufus. Like if you're looking at number 1, it might fit to context, seemingly fit the situation the best, but then Tamar would pay for Amnon just as much as Amnon would. And looking at the story, do we think that that's right or true or good, you know? And then a mix of 1 and 3, also very understandable, right? Number 3, it really actually speaks to the situation, not the incest, but the situation of a virgin and what that meant at the time. So that's actually also a very good option. Number 2 is kind of also what I would say. But that's more actually in how I view justice today. If I were actually in the Hebrew mindset, I would also be debating between 1 and 3, or maybe by chance putting them together. So whose decision was it to make at the time to judge Amnon's fate?
King David.
Sorry?
King.
David.
Yeah, King. King.
Okay, and sorry?
King David, louder, guys.
Okay, King David, yes. Gotcha. Yeah. So in part, King David, he is the ruler and the king overseeing all, judicial situations and justice at the time. But they do have a system that they're supposed to be following that would be a judicial system, seemingly. And it partakes with the leaders of the tribe of the area, right, where the sin is taking place, and also what's known as the avenger of blood, which would be the person that would either follow through with the consequence of death, like the punishment if it were death. And we don't see any of that. Right? We don't see either the old Levitical law of handling it, and we also don't see David doing anything about it. But what we see is Absalom. Now, the text and the context of the text, it's quite tricky because Tamar, she cannot make a case against her brother. Okay, so she rips her clothes and she makes it clearly known that she has been violated, as if stating a claim of a case to happen. But she also knows there's no witnesses, which is why Amnon has done this in secret. So there's very little ability for a non-subjective case, or sort of for the judicial system really to make and kind of put somebody to death, okay, if they were going to follow that law or practice accordingly in the Hebrew culture. Now, we have seen many stories where they're not following their law or judicial system so far. So is it okay that David does nothing about this? Is there confliction there? It's Amnon, his firstborn child. The text says he loves him. The text really shows a lot with his sons and their violations, that he oftentimes is just in a lot of I would say almost pain about what's happening. He doesn't really take positions to punish his children. And I think we have to kind of look at it from the perspective of he's a parent of them, as well as the king of a nation, who doesn't necessarily, on the personal level, carry the ability and the authority to make a decision over their specific cases. As a father, he does, but we're not necessarily talking about family father-child punishment. These are adults, and in our societies today, we would be judged and weighed by our judicial system, and they should have been as well. Now, the problem is David did not make that happen either. So you can consider that and continue to think about it. But what we're going to see is Absalom. Absalom is going to take this and it's going to become a personal justice system. Okay, he does what he thinks his father should have done or what he thinks the judicial system should be doing. He's going to take matters into his own hands. And it's not quick. It's a 2-year progression and plan and plot to destroy Amnon and take him out. Now, it's not all about Tamar, I would say, because Absalom definitely does have a claim to the throne if Amnon is out of the way. So we're also seeing a struggle here with man's, not just man dealing with, the fate of unjust situation, but also greed and personal desire and by chance jealousy or contempt with his brother. Okay, so we're gonna see in the rest of 13 how Absalom takes his brother's life. He gets David to allow them all to go to a festivity, and then all of his brothers are also there. So all the sons of David again are partaking in sin. So we see that sin is not just the effect of sin, but people are included, right, in plots of murder and death, which then makes them associated to certain levels. We don't have description how much or the specifics, but they're there. And at that party, he's going to have men kill Amnon, and then the sons are going to flee, okay? And interesting to note that the text says that at that point, the sons mounted their horses and fled, either in fear that somehow there's a kind of a civil war breaking out, that they're going to be killed because these are the sons of the king, or because it's not Absalom himself, right, at that point. Or potentially they were in on it and they did know, and then they flee and they run. I would go with the first option. By the way, they return to Jerusalem, not afraid of their own lives, not afraid of their own consequences, okay? But nonetheless, they're included and involved, which is quite sad. Okay. So now looking at Absalom and his decisions and his choices, okay? Clan responsible for capital punishment. According to Exodus 21, murder is a capital crime. It's evident in the Namu code, okay? So this is a text of law. It would ordinarily be within the right of the jurisdiction of the clan to carry out this sentence. However, it is possible that the avenger of blood, okay, is not a member of the clan. It normally would have been, needed to have been a member of the clan, okay? And potentially was hired to carry out the sentence. Now this is the sentence on Amnon. This case is further complicated in the lack of witnesses. Even more serious is the element of the heir. This would leave the widow without a caregiver, and the family's land would revert to the clan, the nearest male kin. Okay, so it's just a little insight in how things would have worked, the heritage, what would have been handed over, and kind of in the law side, what kind of alluded to the amount of punishment for murder. Okay, so looking at Amnon's mother from Jezreel, came as David's second wife after he fled from Saul, leaving Michal, his first wife. Okay, Amnon's David's firstborn, but is also the only son of, sorry, I'm not remembering her name, but his mom only had him, okay? So then if we were to think of that her inheritance is in her son and her children and her marriage, her life would potentially be at stake once David's not king anyway, politically. But then second to that would be if Amnon's not taking the throne, or if Amnon in general was to die, she would have no inheritance, she would have nothing, she would essentially equate to a widow. Okay, so in the eyes of the law, this is murder enough to be paid with by death. Okay. So, should Absalom have faced the death penalty for killing Amnon? Justice is not easy, right?
Yes. Yes.
No. Saya sebagai husband, no. I think no.
Nima thinks no. Okay, why?
Because that he helped his sister because his sister couldn't help apa itu namanya? Defend herself. So Absalom do it for his sister. His sister.
Okay. So you would say that he's just in taking a life for the disgrace of his sister. Okay. Is that the only reason he's taking life?
Because the father did not. Yeah, angry because the father did not do anything. Didn't take the. He did not care for the daughter. He favored the son. He favored the son.
Okay. Okay. So is the class agreeing?
Dia cakap dia layakkan mati sebab dia bunuh sin.
I think yes.
Yes.
I feel like, okay.
I think yeah. I think yes. For me, I think it's like he deserves to die. It's because like why Absalom don't go to his father to tell, like to ask for punishment to his brother. Yeah. I mean like yeah. I don't think so. Like, I don't know. He died.
Sebab dia bunuh Amnon, adakah dia patut mati?
All right. Rufus or Elsie, do you guys have any thoughts?
Just a thought. Could it be because David didn't take action on Amnon? Is it because of his trying to cover up, like the mistake that his family has done? Just like fear of people again. Yeah, just like his mistake with Bathsheba. So, and also Amnon is the firstborn, you see. So maybe he was not sure whether he's thinking of him being the next. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the penalty should have been like, how come there's no prison? Life sentence.
Life sentence. I think there is. I think that's potentially what excommunication was. Yeah.
Life sentence.
I like it. Nice points. Rufus, do you have anything?
I think what Absalom did can be covered as justice, but then the way that he do it, justice should be done openly, publicly, in a fair manner. This is usually not how justice is carried. Reason it could be a justified reason. But in this case, we see it's justified that this guy violated his sister, but then justice cannot be carried out in a personal, in a personal way, or there has to be rules in place to ensure that justice is the same for everyone. If not, everyone in this situation can do whatever they think is right for themselves, and then there's no justice really. It's chaos. And also, David should be the one that straight away give out judgment, but in chapter 13:21, they just say that he was angry, but he didn't do anything. And then he opened up the ground for Absalom to take things into his own hands in the wrong way.
Yeah. So I like what you guys are saying. I think that there's so many. I kind of wanted to draw the scene of complexity here, right? And also the tension of personal justice. So I think even for us, we can see what we feel like his personal justice, that Absalom's personal justice is constituted on some level, right? But that's not exactly what God says. That's not the system he set up and gave to them, right? And so this is sin. This is on all accounts, on everyone's account, right? And we're picking up on David's sin of laziness and lack of, I say laziness, but it's not that he wasn't in some sort of strife. These are his sons, right? But his lack of action as a leader of the judicial system, or someone that has say over judicial decisions at the time. Okay, also, it would be interesting if in the text we could see, did Absalom talk to David? What did the discussion look like? Was there any sort of pursuit for the justice system in these matters? We don't see that in the text. And so we need to go with what we see, but it's interesting to think. We don't actually see Absalom pursuing conversation with David. We see him taking matters into his own hands. We don't see really where the court system is, how they're handling things. There's supposed to be this avenger of blood. Was leadership involved? Is the clan involved? But what would it have looked like if Absalom said to David, this needs to happen, and actually talked about what should be happening in terms of the law, right? And that's interesting. It's interesting to think about that he doesn't have the right to take human life, because God doesn't teach man that they have the right to take human life. He has the right, God has the right, and he instructs in different times on that, right? But this is not God's hand. This is not, we don't see him anywhere in the text. And so they should be reverting to the Constitution, to the justice system he's given them, and they're not. So it's a tricky situation, but it plays on kind of our own desire for personal justice and what we think personal justice should have looked like. It just wasn't that simple at the time. Now, all of this should have been brought before the Lord. So we haven't even talked about that. And that's a major theme that we're going to see again, as we really see this kind of split from here in the rest of 2 Samuel, where they're not seeking the Lord anymore. And we're not going to be able to touch on the many other narratives and pieces that we're going to see as this plays out, where Absalom's going to try and take over the throne. He's going to try and take the throne from David, and he's going to be successful for a period of time. He's also going to go into David's concubines, and that is a direct statement that he is the leader of the throne. Okay, so he commits many more abominations against his father, and does become king of Israel for a very short period of time. And David flees, right? David actually flees and goes back to the south during this time. Okay, and this civil war again, or split and divide of the nation, is going to happen again. And then you're going to see when you start read 1st and 2nd Kings, how these abominations lead to the separation of Israel as a nation, but also to the next future generations of kings. So I kind of want to just end this hour kind of leading into that. That, again, sin affects multiple people, and it's generational. And God is consistently trying to show generation after generation who they are in him. And so now you're going to get a deeper look into what that looks like, where God's going to start to be pushing to call his people back to him repeatedly. And the cycle that you saw in Judges, it's going to continue from here on. But Israel and God are going to continue to go like this. as a nation. They're going to continue to walk away from the things of the Lord's heart from this point. Well, we're going to see Solomon and then more so from Solomon, but it does start now. Okay, so let's take a break. I think we're overdue for a break, but we're going to finish with 2 Samuel there. So a 10-minute break.
Thank you. See you.
Yep.
So, Chad is going to try to
Come here.
get a paper so that he can come here. So get ready that he might come here. Belum yet, tapi possibility lah. Possibility. So if he comes, it's going to be in 2 weeks' time. Tahu tak? The left. Dia, tu. Left. Tu.
Left.
Mute.
Oh, mouse there.
Sudah unmute ke Aswin?
Yes. Yes.
Tapi Cici belum.
Oh. Sudah ada yang
Kan lewat sikit tadi. Dia pun nak minta sekarang. Belum sampai 10 minit dari situ. Dia belum balik lagi. Yang balik sudah balik. Macam awal je.
We can start now lah. Yeah, we can start now. Kakak Michelle.
Okay.
All right. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so we're gonna shift gears and we're gonna look at Chronicles. And you guys have read First Chronicles, correct? Yes. Okay, so from your first read of Chronicles, how did you feel about your read? How did your guys' read of Chronicles go?
It's repeated, a lot of names.
Sorry?
Lots of names. Genealogy.
Lots of names, genealogies. Were you bored?
Not yet.
Only few chapters.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, so Chronicles is a bit of a funny read for this week to a lot of people. It's going to, right off the bat from the first read, you might feel like, yeah, you're reading a lot of genealogies, but then also you're reading a lot of accounts that you found in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So sometimes you're feeling like, why am I reading this again? And we're going to look at Chronicles in historical context. Okay, so it's going to be different than what we just did by looking at lots of narrative. We're going to look more at the context of this book. And it helps us read, it helps us understand, it helps us to do IBS and so on. Okay, my computer is not actually shifting. Okay, so you're looking at the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is the first after the canonization, okay? And this is going to be how things were recorded throughout the Hebrew history, kind of how books were placed and scrolls were placed together in Hebrew culture. And then there were many, many other books, but then with canonization, things were narrowed down into these three sections. Okay, so we have the Torah, which we call the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. And then you're going to have the Nevi'im. And the Nevi'im is going to be late prophets and early prophets. And it's going to be Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, which is where we just were. And then you're going to have the Ketubim. And the Ketubim or Ketuvim, that is going to be the scribed records, that is the books of wisdom, the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Job, and you're going to have books that are based in return from exile or period of exile, of Israel's exile. Okay, and so you can see Chronicles is all the way down there with Ezra and Nehemiah. And it is considered, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are considered one scroll all the time, okay? So it's just cool. I think it's cool. Okay? Jewish tradition has always regarded both 1st and 2nd Chronicles to be written by Ezra. and have placed the scrolls with Ezra and Nehemiah's letters in the Hebrew Bible. However, the text itself gives gives no clues to the author's identity. Okay, most scholars today agree it's formally unknown. So there's a lot that's ascribed to Ezra and Nehemiah and the time period it's written in, but the chronicler himself is unknown. Okay, so there's two ideas you can go with for authorship. Either the chronicler post-exilic Jew, unknown, or potentially Ezra, based in Jewish tradition. Okay, originally one scroll is normally kept that way, so we must consider both texts for dating. Okay, so the biggest point of reference we have for the dating is actually found in, wait, let me check that. It says 2 Samuel, but I thought it was Chronicles. Okay, yeah, that's definitely wrong. Sorry. So it's going to be the end of, 2 Samuel ends with, 2 Chronicles ends with Cyrus for the Lord's people to return. Okay, and this makes it clear and also kind of impossible to date the period before exile. Okay, so does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say exile or post-exile? Yeah, okay, so the ultimate exile of Israel and Judah into the hands of Babylon and Assyria. So that's going to happen. We're going to read through books, that's going to happen way later in the weeks. But Chronicles being a book from that time period, we need to talk about it a little bit. Okay, so Cyrus is kind of the biggest note there because it was his decree that allowed the second return. Okay, and then it's also found within 1 Chronicles itself in the genealogy in chapter 9. This is the record of the first returning exiles. Okay, and that's going to place this book potentially sometime after Zerubbabel's death, which is the one who was the king at the time taken. And then the chronicler, so let me read the question. Why would the chronicler need to record this if it was during the first return? So it's just a piece to look at and say, the genealogy would record the first return. So we need to date it after that. Okay, so if the chronicle is in fact linked to Ezra and Nehemiah, like Jewish tradition would state, it's commonly agreed on by scholars, then it would be in the time of King Darius of Persia, most likely before 400 BC. Okay, so Cyrus decrees, but then it's going to be after his decree when he's fallen, and it's going to be the Persian Empire, and it's going to be under Darius. And so when you look at the book of Esther, that's going to be Xerxes and Darius. It's the same kind of time period, around 450 BC. So it's mostly agreed upon to be written around 500 450 BC. And for that, those people that are returning from exile, but also for those who have remained in the land and have come back in the first and second return. The first return. Okay, so paralleling Chronicles and Samuel. At first read, you're going to feel like you're rereading different narratives, different stories of David again. You're going to get some new narratives of David, but these two books were written differently for different purposes and almost between 500 and 6 years apart. So the first Chronicles is going to focus on the spiritual, okay, and David's spiritual acts as king, mainly his care of the ark. It's going to refocus on the priesthood and Levitical worship. It's also going to speak to the preparing of the temple in accordance with God's laws. and David's period of military action. Okay, so it's actually really neat to think, because we get a lot of the internal narrative and personal sin and narrative in 1st and 2nd Samuel between, the kings and the sons, and David himself and Saul and Solomon. But here, we're actually getting to see what David did to restore. Okay, so the text in Samuel says he restores it, but now here we're actually going to get the narrative that shows how he did it. And it might be a little boring to us, but it's really cool to see all the things that he did to actually reinstate the priesthood, to make sure the temple was held to standard, the things of the Lord that the Lord cared about, as pretty much the only king that Israel had with a heart really truly seeking the Lord. Okay, and so the difference there is the narrative focus on David's personal life versus the spiritual needs and government needs. Why would the chronicler need to record history? Okay, it's written to 2nd, 3rd generations, born to those who returned to Judah and Israel, and those who never left into exile, but married the colonists who were sent in by the Babylonian and Persian Empire. Okay, so there's a group of people that never actually left the land of Israel, but Israel was captured and taken over by Babylon and Assyria. And so there's going to be people of different tribes that were included, that were conquered from other lands, part of part of Babylon, part of Assyria, because when they took over, they included people in and basically just made them people of their nation, enforced laws and things over them. But this means that there's mass diversity. And so we see there's going to be lots of different tribes and people groups that would then have been put in Israel and in and in Judah at this time, and then have lived there for almost 600 years. Okay, so so there's going to be a need to redraw the roots of identity as who they are as Israelites. Okay, so the main purpose is to serve as a recording of their history before exile, teaching them of their lineage and identity as Israelites under Yahweh. Okay, and a record of David's care of the tabernacle, ark, and priesthood before the temple was built. This was important to the returning exiles as they needed hope to encourage them, and as they continued to rebuild their nation and spiritual divinity. So they may have started to rebuild a nation, but they didn't necessarily know how to. And so the chronicler is going to tell these next generations of what was done, what David did, and how to continue that, and what should be done by accounts, but also what the people who the first return have done already. Okay, so looking at David's narratives and what he kept, it's going to teach them a few pretty big things governmentally and politically. Okay, so it's giving them an idea of the political needs that David took care of, which is also going to teach them about national security, centralized government, and trustworthy administration. So it's going to be the do's and the don'ts. It's going to show that David responds faithfully to Israel's deepest needs. Okay, and then it's obviously going to meet the spiritual, the religious needs, the restoration of the center of worship, how to do that in the holy way to the Lord, and then a restoration of liturgy and the priesthood. So liturgy meaning the actual religious acts. So the burning of sacrifices, the oil in the lamps, the fresh bread at all times, the burning on the altar being like the flame being lit all the time. So the understanding there goes deep. And that's why we get the recording of who is doing these things and how they're doing these things and all of the very specific things. It's almost like going back to the Pentateuch a little bit when you're looking at the instruction, that this is just a re-account of instruction on how to how David did things, and thus then they need to do things. So my question, how do you know where you came from or your family history? So take a minute and just discuss this with yourselves, with each other.
Wow, my Chinese.
Jadi ada datang dari sini. Salah satu.
I come from
Abraham. Adam.
I come from David.
Ya,
Tapi
Bang.
Adam juga
Grace. Asyik. Asyik.
Awak lebih lah.
Dia mungkin dari Arab.
Bermakku. Wow. You're Malaysian tribal people, mah. How long? Orang asli tinggal di Malaysia.
Itu ya.
Berapa lama?
Dekat.
Asli ke bulan-bulan.
Berapa lama kita tinggal di sini?
Saya pergi
Beratus tahun.
sampai
Anggaran.
Mengaku gila ni. Satu bulan. Sudah sebulan kali badannya.
Kamu dari mana?
Okay. So I know that wasn't a whole lot of time, but let me just hear a little bit from someone. How do you know where you came from or your family history?
For me, I don't really know because I don't stay with my biological parents.
Okay.
No time to study.
Does the family you stay with, do they have like any sort of heritage way of remembering their heritage that's specific?
Stepsister.
Okay.
I just want to share because I mixed. My mom side is from Indonesia, but also has a mix of apa tu Belanda, Dutch,
Dutch?
Netherlands, and then my father is Chinese, and he's from maybe Guangzhou, China. That's where the Cantonese tribe comes from. Yeah, so somewhere there, and then along the line, Tower of Babel, and then Abraham, Noah, Adam, and Eve.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so there's not a specific tradition or anything that you could actually remember the line you come from. But you do know by your father and his father to a certain extent. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Rufus or Elsie, do you want to share if anything from your side?
My side is a mixture. Yeah. So my father's side, I think they are from China. I don't know what tribe or whatever. I don't know. My
Okay.
mom's side, because her father is Chinese and her mom is Indian. So her father is from China. He has a China wife and a Malaysian Indian wife. So my grandmom is from India. Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. There's so many different directions to go in. I like it. Okay. Rufus, anything from you? Do you want to share?
The only one that I know is the one, all the details shared to me by my parents, but then we don't really talk about it because it's not a very nice thing to talk about. Just it's complicated lah. Yeah, so whatever I know, it just passed down. Lor.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, for me, it's also similar to what you guys are saying. I have, on my father's side, there's European descent. Well, for both my parents, it's European descent, right? But then it's lots of different European nations. So there's German and there's Italian and there's English and there's Irish and right. And I can trace some of that back, right? If I look specifically at my mom or specifically at my dad and my grandparents will know things, and then maybe a cousin will know, and then, but I can't really go back further than, maybe 100 years, which would be actually that's really great for my family. Anyway, okay. In Africa, people actually know they have clan names still, and so they actually know all the way back to their what like the Bible would call the patriarchs, like Angie mentioned, like Abraham and Isaac, Noah. They would know all the way back to the beginning sons of their tribe in their last name, and so they actually learn to recite the last name that leads all the way back specifically, so they know what clan they belong to and how that's rooted back to the first king of their tribe. And then as well, that keeps them in their system from intermarriage, so that they cannot marry within their own clan. Okay, so it's really interesting for me because I had never ever heard of that before, but they have oral history, and they're that's how they keep record and know who they are, which is a really wonderful and amazing trait, and it seems incredibly impossible to me. But they also have a system of matriarch or patriarch, which means they can be mixed. They can be of 2 different tribes or 3 different tribes or whatnot, but they always follow their father, and that determines their clan. So Israel is the same, very similar, not the same, sorry. Israel is actually very, very similar in the way that they would have remembered their history and the way they would have known where they came from, in traditional tribal view, okay? So when we read genealogical records, we keep in mind for these being a people that, again, like we've said, there's many different nations. It's been 600 years. So this is not, direct descent of blood. Even if you were descending from David at this point, you're possibly of Persian, you're Persian, or you're Scythian, or you could have lots and lots of different types of heritage, belong to different people groups, okay? So looking at the genealogies, this is helpful for that, but also other tips when you're reading genealogies, which you guys have read a lot of genealogies, but I think you'll read some again. So you want to keep in mind, you can mark the names you've heard of in previous books Okay, this helps us kind of understand how they might be thinking or what it might mean to them to read specific names. Pay attention to one sentence phrase next to person's name. So you'll find these little phrases or sayings or kind of notes on these people randomly in the genealogies that actually dates that person and nation and what's happening in that time. Notice statements about land and numbers of people. And then also important to pay attention to the female bloodlines or male bloodlines. Israel is very, very unique in that their genealogies will go from patriarchal to matriarchal to patriarchal to matriarchal. And we're going to look at that a little bit. Okay. So from Adam to Abraham in chapter 1, this is actually a recount from Genesis. Okay, and as oral history learners, they would read this or hear this, and they would think back to the first genealogy in Genesis. Okay, and it shows this historical record of how well they passed down their oral and written traditions in history. But it would also remind the returning exiles the providence of God's promise to Abraham fulfilled. So the very first genealogy is quite a big statement in line with talking about what is holy, talking about roots, where you come from. This is restating all of that. From Abraham to Jacob. Okay, so again, there we have the patriarchs as the fathers of the nation. Okay, and that's going to remind the retelling of the story of all the stories and how that happened, Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, and right. Okay, you have the sons of the concubine of Abraham is included. Okay, so that's our first inclination to inclusivity. In 132, 133, you're going to see the name Midian. Okay, so now we know Midianites were categorized as pagans who would cause Israel's eyes to wander from Yahweh while in the wilderness. But now a reminder, they are in the bloodline of Adam and God. Okay, and anytime you see a name that represents a nation, this is what this should mean to the returning exiles. They were once people of rebellion against the Lord, but God was actually the creator of them. Okay, the author notes Esau and Israel, not Jacob. So that's just a bit of a little interesting piece there from the chronicler that just also leads to that he's focusing on the spiritual of things. He's wanting them to focus on God being the one creating the nation. So Israel, instead of Jacob, would remind that God gave him that name. And then the covenant with man would also be something that could be recognized there. Okay, the kings who reigned from Edom or in Edom before any king over you. Okay, it's interesting that's a little side note, before any king over you. And Edomites became Israel's enemy when we leave off in Samuel. And there's a progression of enemies, of course, by the time they're returning from exile. So again, this is a reminder of God's authority, before you ever had a king, okay? Before David, before Saul, okay? Edom was a son of Adam, so to speak. But also that God gave the authority for rulings and for systems even before David. The account turns from the line of heritage into reigning kings in Edom, inclusive of the wife and daughter. So it's just taking note that the account goes from his son to his son to his son to all of a sudden your readings about this king to this king to this king. Okay, so it's showing something there again about authority and God's placement of authority. Okay, so Israel to David in 2:17 becomes inclusive of women's bloodlines. Okay, so it goes from a patriarch account to a matriarch account, and it shows David's sister Abigail becomes a matriarchal. And it includes Egyptians. Okay, so one thing to also realize in genealogies, you're going to have the first account from Genesis, which shows that God created everything, but then you're also going to see inclusion of nations through slaves, okay? And through, so it's also going to talk about, really kind of show God's heart for even those who have abandoned him. They're brought back in. And they're not just brought back in spiritually, they're brought back in literally through the bloodline. Okay, the line of Reuben in 5:1-2 will tell them why Reuben, son of Israel, lost his birthright to Joseph. That's a needed reminder. Again, this is basically for the people returning from exile. This is a recount. Remember why Joseph, why God chose Joseph over Reuben's sin. Okay, the line of the first return exiles. This is going to be much closer to home for them. Okay, in chapter 9, the author notes first the reason for Judah's exile in the first place. So remember well why because this would be like maybe their great grandparents or second great, all right? So remember why this happened in the first place. And then the priests and the Levites and the temple servants. Okay, so it's also showing what they did and what they needed to do upon return. And what they did first was spiritual. What they did first was what they could understand to the best that was glorifying to God. And the temple, and that God would dwell with them again. Okay, then you just see some repeated things within these genealogies. So you have a repeated genealogy of Saul, chapter 8 and chapter 9:35. So just to compare those two, chapter 8 starts from Benjamin, and the line goes back to the son of Jacob. Okay, so it shows his connection to Jacob and God. Okay, and it ends declaring that all were Benjaminites. So it's inclusive of the whole tribe, but then it also ends with the sons of Azel's brother, Ulam. Okay, which is different. In 9:35, it starts with the house of Jael of Gibeon. Okay, and then it ends with Azel's sons, and not Ulam or the brother. It's not inclusive of any of his other relatives. We don't really, at this time, have any explanation as to why this is noted, but it seems evident that the chronicler had a reason for the returning exiles. One thought, there's lots of thoughts between scholars. One thought could be that it shows his ties to Gibeon, simply. What that would have meant to returning exiles, besides those who maybe would be able to trace their heritage to him, I'm not sure. Okay, other things to note with these genealogies. Listed second is the dynasty of King David. Okay, it's interesting that he's listed before the tribes and the clans, right? Because he came much later. And he's a product of those tribes and clans. This may show the importance of the providence of David and the Lord's covenant with him. Okay, so the way that the chronicler has listed these genealogies is important to those returning from exile. It's going to speak of David's authority. It's going to put him on the same level with patriarchs themselves. And that is going to be a backing to GRP. It's going to be the covenant, a reminder of the covenant and the promise. Because those genealogies are the reminder of the promise God made to them, right? And so this is the continuation of that. The chronicler follows David's line with Judah's. This is also interesting because Judah is the fourth son of Jacob, Israel, not the first. But Judah is noted that the promise would come through the scepter of Judah. So there again, that's going to back the promise and the covenant of the Lord to the returning exiles. That you see David, who the promise is made through, and then it says it's going to come through Judah's line, and we're seeing a partial fulfillment of that. And it should be a reminder to them, just like the others of the promise. Thank you. Okay, Benjamin is listed twice and seems to be given recognition that's special along with Levi. There we can gather this is because of their honor and loyalty to the temple and David through his reign. So again, the chronicler is focusing on what is spiritual with the Levites and those that have honored the Lord in history. Zebulun and Dan are not recorded. Okay, so at this point, those two tribes are not really existing. We don't know why. There's little information about it. But as you continue to read forward in 2 Kings and stuff, you're going to see that they're really going to stop showing up altogether. Okay, so if we consider the second and third generations from exile, we can gather a couple of important messages they needed to receive. Okay, the first is the real Israel was in Judah and Jerusalem, and the returning exiles from Persia rebuilt the temple and community. Okay, so they needed to understand where the Lord came into the tabernacle and where the first temple was built in their heritage. And then the second thing is that the greatest danger at that time was that the people of the land did not go into exile, but intermarried with the tribes brought in from elsewhere. So there was persecution from the people that had taken over the land, infiltrated the land, and the people that were Israelites at first that are now more Persian or descent of Babylon or Scythian, and they're not identifying with their Israel roots at all, and therefore they have been persecuted the first generation to return, and they're going to continue. Okay. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. Let's go ahead and take our break. So, what is it?
The paper you gave me? Oh. Oh.
Favorite character kan dia sibuk dia macam
Oh, ni kan hotel dulu belum?
Oh, sorry.
Tidak lah.
Teruskan aja.
Cakap lah. Cakap.
Hi Michelle. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you doing?
He wants to chat and he's shy and he disappeared.
Stop.
After you show your face.
Michelle, I want to ask what your favorite character of God?
My favorite what?
Character
Character of God.
in the Bible. Yes. We want to hear from you.
That's a hard one. I don't know if I have a favorite because I think I like all the characteristics of God. Is that the golden star answer? No. I can't say I have a favorite, man. I'm sorry. I mean, I think I'm most thankful for the grace of God. Yeah.
Michelle,
How about you? Yeah?
I'm curious. What year are you born in?
Wow.
I am not answering that.
You.
I don't know how to respond right now.
Very difficult.
I'm just kidding. I'm 33.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
No way.
I am.
No way.
You guys are so sweet.
Hey, Ashley,
Okay, is everybody back?
first travel, your favorite? She was asking.
Oh, sorry, what?
Did you ask me just now? I forgot. Oh yeah, it's okay lah. Maybe we don't have time to chat. Yeah.
We don't have time to chat. We'll chat later, after.
Okay lah, start.
Okay, sorry for the sister from my staff, but I've been very curious. Okay, so welcome back to the last session. If you have any questions, feel free to ask Michelle. If not, personal question, you can leave it offline. If not, Michelle, feel free to start.
Yeah. Actually, I'm okay. I'm not sure if you guys have my email, but I'm more than okay for you guys to email me any questions that you might have. And then just because we don't have a lot of ability or flexibility with time and so on. So if you think of some later, feel free. Okay, so jumping back in. First Chronicles. Okay, so we're going to look at some religious context and context of Persia and Babylon at the time that these guys would have been coming out of or inheriting, so to speak. Okay, so Marduk is the main god at the time. He's considered the Lord of all gods in heaven and earth. He won this position as a god in battle with Tiamat, the god of chaos. Prior to this, Marduk was considered the god of storms. Okay, so there's this ideology with the gods that things were created out of war or killing within this culture. And so Marduk became the greatest god by killing other gods, essentially. And Tiamat, god of chaos, would have been one of the strongest gods because chaos is rules in nature and society in their concept and their perspective. Okay. The main temples, you have a ziggurat found in Babylon. It's both the temples would be called the Esagila and the Atemenanki. I'm really terrible at pronouncing these names, so have grace on me. But this is a picture here of kind of what the temples would look like and how they were built. So the tower-like one is the ziggurat, okay? And then the flat one is the, I think it's the esagila. Yes, the esagila. So Babylon's placed their idols and gathered for festivals and worship in the flat kind of lower temple that was for them, right? Set apart from their deities. And then the temple, the Etemenanki, is considered to be reaching to Marduk, to be reaching, so he would be depicted at the top, but it would be reaching to the heavens, right? And then there's this understanding and need of kind of magic or trickery or different things that you would do in order to be able to reach to him. Okay? The mentality, the belief was all nature, including humanity, owed its existence to him. The destiny of the kingdoms and subjects was in his hands. Okay, so anyone in royalty or anyone in control, it was at Marduk's will. And he's called the protector. So he was important in the Babylon sense of security and personal identity. When the city would revolt against Persia in 485, this is the time of Xerxes, okay, this statue was destroyed. Okay, and Persia did this on purpose because they knew that these people would understand or believe that they had no security anymore. And so this would send them into chaos. So it's just, this is how intense and combined their belief system and who they were and how they were protected or how they were growing as an empire was really based on this one god, Marduk. Kings of Assyria and Persia also honored Marduk and sought it for its authority and rebuilt the temples in their own nations. And then, of course, once overtook Babylon, also included Marduk. He was thought to be deeply enriched in consciousness of the Babylonians. Their conquerors had to pay respects to the deity. Okay, the Kassites, who would conquer, they previously conquered Babylon to this point, but they wrote, the new king at the coronation had to take the hands of Marduk, either literal or by way of clasping the hands, or a figurative manner by assuming kingship under his guidance, or so to say, oh, this god is teaching me how to be a king. Okay. And then similarly, rulers would, after the fall of Neo-Babylon, okay, after the fall of the empire in the 6th century, Cyrus, which is who's scribed to in the Bible, the same king, he would promote himself to have been chosen by Marduk, who was destined to rule the city of Babylon. So Cyrus himself would have played, I don't know if he did this honestly or if he played along. He played along with this idea that Marduk was giving him the power and therefore he was somewhat of a demigod himself. But this would have given him authority over the Babylonians at the time. And that's what he was trying to do. Okay, so Persia had many gods, a monotheistic culture. These are 12 ancient deities that then would progress in their names and what they were deities over time. Okay, and by the time the exiles are living under their empire, things have changed a little bit. So they're an Aryan society. That's a class of people, not a race, and meaning free or noble. They were inclusive of multiple people groups, and these are just a few of them from the time period. Okay, and then this monotheistic religion or polytheistic religion or multiple gods becomes somewhat of a monotheistic, a one god, and it's called Zoroastrianism. It's named after a guy, Zoroaster. Okay, and he adopted by the Persian Empire in 550 to 330. So this is the time period that these guys are either coming back or just the Israelites who would have stayed in exile, because some did that as well, potentially would have taken this religion on, or this idea on. Okay, there is the belief. There's one supreme deity, Ahura Mazda. He's the first Lord listed in the polytheistic list of gods. Okay, he's the Lord of wisdom, creator, sustainer of all things, and encourages expression of faith through good thought, good words, and good deeds. Sound familiar? This belief system came from the polytheistic many gods, ancient Persian religion, which regarded Ahura Mazda as the greatest of the gods, and like the later, I'm not going to try and say that word right now, saw life as a struggle between the forces of light and goodness and those of darkness and evil. So basically they became a system that worshipped Ahura Mazda the most. But then it sounds very similar to a lot of religions that we know around us today, right? Like there's similarities in Taoism and Buddhism and even Hinduism and certain gods in Hinduism, and right, this idea of good and evil and attention there, and then somehow an authority that needs your attention or needs you to devote yourselves to them. Okay, Cyrus of Persia was noted to serve Marduk. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king of Babylon, who takes Judah into exile, he contributed to the building of the ziggurat. And Daniel, this is one of the main gods that he's going to deal with when you read there. Xerxes, king of Persia, in 484, he is recorded to have destroyed the temple of Marduk, which we also saw earlier. And we can gather the exiles would have been enveloped in this society of great worship of these deities. Okay, so we're looking at 500 to 600 years under these societies, cultures, religions. And they were a people dispersed, taken into different places because they were taken in as, I don't want to say slaves, but captives of war, right? So these nations wouldn't have taken them and put them all in one place, but they would have dispersed them in different places for different reasons. And you'll see that as well as you read ahead in the Bible and read about the exile. Okay. We need to consider how easy it would be to lose sight of God, worship, identity, and start including rituals, other gods, or mixing worship practices together. Now, Israel has not done this for the last 1,000 years, but now we're just simply getting a context of the different gods that this would be happening with, and really that not having a nation. As a people who would lose their nation, that would also mean losing their God. Okay, and that's a structural belief at the time. So now again, we're looking at generations later from the people who lost their nation and lost their authority under God, lost Yahweh's favor essentially, and now these guys are the ones that are coming back. Do they know who they are in any way whatsoever is the question that we need to wrestle with when we read Chronicles and when we're asking questions to Chronicles and looking at the text. And also when we're looking at the text and we're looking at certain stories of David, what does it mean to them to be reading these stories or recanting them or being reminded of things and promises? So I would say not everybody lost. I don't think that Israelites lost 100% of their culture, especially because Babylon and Assyria were not nations that stripped you of identity, but there was probably a lot of mixing going on. Okay, so just to finish kind of we looked at the genealogy, so now just finishing looking at the direction the rest of the book's going to go in. It's going to be David's beginning and reign and coronation over the 12 tribes. Then how David solidified the kingdom politically and religiously. Okay, that's going to be Davidic covenant established by Yahweh. David's purchase site of the new temple. Okay, then how he makes preparations in accordance with that for the temple. The materials he organizes. and then he's going to charge Solomon to the position over the Davidic dynasty, but ultimately that Solomon's going to carry out actually building his temple. So essentially you'll see from this book, David hands Solomon everything he needs on a silver platter. That's it. I think you guys know what that means. That's just an idiom from my country. Right? He hands him everything he needs very easily. Okay. So parallel narratives really quickly, right? We saw parallel genealogies. Now you're going to see similar stories coming up. So the Lord's covenant with David, 1 Chronicles 17 and 2 Samuel 7. Then you're going to see David in the ark and Uzzah. And you're also going to see David's census repeated. And then you're going to see David and his mighty battles and some of the battles with his men, okay? So we're going to actually just do an exercise with this. So I think Elsie and Rufus can be group 1 again. And then in the classroom you can, I think you were going in group 2 and 3 as well again. So you're going to want to, you're going to go through these parallel narratives. That's just an exercise. I want you to read through the passage, mark differences you see. Of course, take note of what the overall meaning you think is of these passages. And then I want you to think about the generation after exile. Okay, what would they receive from 1 Chronicles? Are there any questions at all to that? No? Okay. I think we're going to take... I'll probably actually give you guys a bit longer here. So let's do like 10 to 12 minutes. Because I really want you to observe the text and really ask, what could this mean to them? Try and take on their mindset, okay?
So we'll come back at 11:45, maybe?
Do we get breakup?
Yeah, I'm breaking you guys up. Yeah. Kami selalu aktif. Masih sambil dulu. The least disaster. Just send the PowerPoint video. The forces of the deserts, Soba, and television thousand soldiers. He prepared all chariots, horses, except enough for 100 chariots. When the Arameans from Damascus arrived to help him in the desert, David killed 22,000 of them. Wow. Then he placed several in the army garrison in Damascus. Army in became David's subject and paid him tribute. So the Lord made David victorious wherever he went. David brought gold shield of Ebenezer's officers to Jerusalem, along with a large amount of bronze from the Ebenezer town of Ipoh. And Dorothy, when King Saul of Hamath heard that David had destroyed the entire army of Ebenezer, he sent his son Joab, and whether King David was successful, and campaign. The reason how the enemies and war present David with many gifts of silver, gold, bronze, King David had all the gifts of God as he did simply to the nations in Judah. Medium war among these unlike and the villages and Nova, Rehob, king of Zobah. So David became even more famous when he fled from his home 15,000 miles in the valley of Saul. He placed armed garrison throughout Israel and all the keeping David subject. In fact, the Lord made him victorious wherever he went. So David went into all Israel and did what was just and right in all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was commander of the army. Joseph, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Son of Ahimelech, son of Amminadab, of Syria, was the son of Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was the king of Judah, and David's son is his mother. It's different from After this, David defeated and subdued the Philistines by conquering Gath and its 17 towns. David also conquered the land of Moab and the Moabites, who were spread between David's subjects and paid him tribute. David also destroyed the forces of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, among the summer. Then Hadadezer outshone the Syrians, with consort with the river, captured 7,000 chariots, 7,000 chariots, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He prepared all the chariots and troops of the 100 chariots. When Arameans from Damascus arrived to help King Hadadezer, David killed 22,000 of them. When he placed several army garrisons in Damascus, the Arameans and the Arameans taken David subject and paid him to give money to the Lord, and David victorious wherever he went. David brought the gold shield of Hadadezer's officers to Jerusalem, along with a large amount of bronze from Hadadezer's from Ipoh and Han. Later, Solomon mastered the bronze and melted it into the third bronze basin for the sea. The pillars and the various bronze articles used at the temple. When King Toy of Hamath heard that
Ini yang berbeza ada sebutan Solomon.
the entire army of King Hadadezer of Zobah, he sent his son Joab from King David for his successful campaign. Hadadezer and Toy had been enemies and were often at war. Joab presented David with many gifts of gold, silver, and bronze. Then David dedicated all his gifts to the Lord, along with his silver and gold and the temple. Other nations, Moab, Ammon, Philistine, and the David also placed army garrisons in Edom and mana dia divided dia punya orang tu, macam mana dia
Armenian.
orang yang dia takluk tu macam mana dia divide. Di sini cakap they Samuel, they apa he compared, he measured them, put them in a row. Tapi di sini tak ada. Yang cakap they paid him tribute money. So maybe kita tulis dari one, yes, in Samuel, second goes up in detail, how they did, they paid. And then di sini di sini ayat 8 Solomon later Solomon melted the bronze. Mana ni census chronicle? Mana second Samuel? No, we say compare first Chronicles and to second Sam 2, which is not the census.
Very different.
Very different. I think it's the wrong passage.
Want to ask her?
Yes. Where is the census done?
End of the second Samuel
24.
24.
Was mentioned.
Want to make sure.
He was doing something.
I read that one also.
Yeah. Michelle, I think for the group 2, you wanting to compare David's census in First Chronicle and Second Samuel, but I think the census is not in chapter 2, but in Second Samuel chapter 24. I just want to double confirm. Is that what you meant?
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And just apparently missing the 4.
So 24.
Do you guys want more time, Grace?
Do you need more time? Okay. Beberapa minit. Just few more minutes.
Yep, that's totally fine. Okay, let's go ahead and grab the guys from the breakout room.
Kenapa ini penting? Perbezaan ini, perbezaan ini penting untuk
All right, welcome back. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with group 1. Go ahead and just give first kind of the differences that you saw, and then go ahead and answer the second question.
Hey, Rufus.
Okay. Was first that between the account in Samuel and the account in Chronicles, the account of Samuel combined the whole event into, it seems like one event, like they move the card first, their first attempt failed, and then they straight away link it to the second movement, while in Chronicles there was a division when they first failed, and then Uzzah was struck down because of that. Things happened in between before the second attempt to move the ark. Yeah, like between of chapter 14 and then other stuff. Yep. So we and will describe more of what happened, and Chronicles describe more of how it was happened, like especially for the second part, where you see David, he got the appropriate people, the Levites, give each of them roles, who to carry the ark, who to play music, how to do it. So there was much more planning involved according to whenever moving the ark. So in verse 6, we don't see instructions followed. I mean, chapter 6, Chronicles, we see it being done how God wants it to be done. And chapter 6, we see at the end David's wife, Michal, how she kind of get judged because of her words. She was unable to bear children until she died, but we don't see it in Chronicles. Yeah, I think any other differences I missed, Elsie?
You're doing a really great job. I think you're covering most of them.
Okay,
So go ahead and tell me, what do you guys think stood out to the returning exiles?
Stood out. I think can see from what you shared from the intended audience of Chronicles is it was more of a instruction for them who they are, who they were supposed to be, and how they were supposed to carry out their religious and national duties. So Chronicles is written with much more instructions as to what should be done, versus Samuel, where you just see the list of events, but not instructions as to what must be done properly. So I think that's the main one. The content because of who it was written for.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the generation should know how to move the ark when they need, because at the time, I think the temple also was destroyed, right, after exile. I'm not sure, I forget.
Yeah, it's really, really good. Yeah, at this time, the ark was actually lost. So, even just that would say a lot about who they were and their heritage and hope. So good, awesome. Let's hear from group 2.
Bayaran
Can group 3 go first?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
More detail is coming. So as we read this one is as we read Samuel, Second Samuel and First Chronicles 18. So we can see that the difference is more detail in book of Second Chronicle, First Chronicles, like more detail in terms of what happened, what is going on in that area.
So the differences are, if you see in Samuel verse 1 to 2, there are more details on how David, what did David do to the Moabites and the people that has lost, and how they paid the tribute money. And then in verse 8, in Chronicles, Solomon was mentioned. But in Samuel, Solomon was not mentioned. And then verse 17 in Chronicles, that the last verses in both chapters, the way the son David's sons are mentioned, different title of this thing. In Chronicles, they are called the chief assistant, king's chief assistant, and then in Samuel, they are called king's priestly leaders. So that's what we saw. And then so the question for the after the exile generation, Esther?
Yeah, so during the exile there's no temple because already destroyed. But after they come back from the exile, they rebuilt the temple. So for them to know the temple, to know about the temple, there must be a mention about it lah. And also in Solomon, in Chronicle. So in Chronicle also it's mentioned about God is the one who gives them victory. So for them to know that.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, so that they will know, the people from exile, they need to know that God is the one who gives victory to them lah.
How is in verse 7 what Solomon did with the bronze that was given, because they mentioned here, where is it? Oh my gosh. He melted the bronze and molded into great bronze basin called the sea, and the pillars and the various bronze articles used at the temple. So this is our what we think is that when they rebuild the temple, this one must be there.
They need to return here. I don't know.
Solomon must be there.
No.
What he did, the bronze, the pillar.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So the instruction of that, or the meaning of that. Okay. Okay. Gotcha. Yes. Awesome. I love the victory of the Lord. That's huge. Okay, is group 3 ready?
Chapter 2 Samuel is God is the one asked David to take the census, but in Chronicles, he himself made the decision to take the census. Yeah, can you hear it? From the book of Second Samuel, God is the one that asked him, David, to take the census. but in Chronicles, he himself caused to take the census.
Is there anything else you guys see? Or I'm not sure where you guys went.
That's it. Yeah, for now.
Oh, you're not done yet. Okay, that's okay. There's a lot to kind of go through and look at. In regards to the census, essentially what you're grappling with, well, it is First Chronicles is also going to show, like similar to the others, more reasoning as to how this was a sin of David. Because what you guys hit on is actually a huge part and aspect of understanding the census and how it was sin. Because in Samuel, you're going to see it's attributed to the Lord's anger against Judah for their sins. But then in Chronicles, the chronicler is actually going to say that Satan, is the one who's at the hand, is the one who's telling David, or tempting David, however you want to say that. But this, again, is an example of the chronicler is focusing on the spiritual, okay? And so the reality is, if the Lord comes and speaks in anger against Judah for their sins, that is, and then secondly, that David also chose to take the census not how the Lord told him to. Okay, if you see the direction the Lord actually tells him in 2 Samuel, he doesn't take it according to how God instructs him, and he sends, I think it's Joab, and who actually rebukes him for it at that point, showing that David's heart was not in the right position over the census for the Lord. Okay, and so whether or not David's heart in this section is either in pride or in passivity to the nation's sin, we're not 100% sure, but either one of those could have been his sin or both potentially. Okay, and the chronicler is going to address the spiritual of this. So the chronicle is giving a little more information about the census and it's a sin. And so he just goes straight to Satan being the tempter. The regards to how isn't necessarily his point, but he's going straight to the deed of the census, and he's giving more information. And it's so that people will understand, again, the burden of sin, once again, the burden of disobeying Yahweh, but also to pay attention to how they should be rebuilding as a nation, how they should be taking care to understanding how many people are within them, what their direction is, what they're supposed to be doing in accordance with the priesthood and the law. And the government as a nation. Okay, so I think that was really awesome. You guys pulled out a lot out of the other two narratives, and that was my hope with this, is that you guys would really just see the different contexts around the book. And also, First Chronicles is great there again, because what it brings to us is a lot more information to help us kind of understand some of these deeper narratives that we find in 1st and 2nd Samuel. So I'm going to end with just these questions and thinking about those in exile, okay? It would have brought hope, it would have brought identity, a sense of understanding, and not just the practical elements, but really a deep understanding, a deepening, I think. Because I think the people that chose to return were people that wanted to understand Yahweh and live as Israelites again. Okay? So I think we can compare for ourselves, what are the struggles around us spiritually and culturally? Because they had huge spiritual and cultural afflictions at the time. And then what rhythms or actions could we do to hold on to our identity as Christ followers in the midst of that? Because we as humans today, we're still struggling, I think, in a lot of different ways, or tempted, or maybe with family, believing in different religions, or spiritual abuse around us, and even the Christian church. in Africa, we have lots of different forms of Christianity. And America is not different. You know, so the enemy likes his trickery, and he likes his foolery and deception. So I think this is the main thing we can kind of walk away with for ourselves and saying, wow, thank the Lord that we serve a glorious God that would show us all of these things in our inheritance, because we are included in the bloodline of Christ now. But also to remember, God, how do we stand firm on you in the midst of these things, the same way the exiles had to learn how to stand firm on you. Okay, I'm going to just pray. So, Father, I thank you that you are our identity in a lot of different ways, God. I thank you that we get to see a picture of how much you cared about humanity, how much you realigned Israel and the exiles from beginning to finish, God, that you brought them into a land and gave them the resources and gave them the ability to understand who they are again. And I thank you that you teach us through Christ, and you teach us through your promises, and you teach us by your word who we are today, and that you set us apart, Father. And so I just pray as we go forward, knowing in our own lives where we struggle, knowing in our personal depth where things are hard for us, whether it's family or friends or relatives or, God, I thank you that you set us apart, and you continue to show us what it means to face persecution, to stand firm on your ground, and what it means to just spend time with you and be holy. And I pray against the enemy and his tactics of confusion. And I just ask that you would continue to guide us, continue to guide these students, continue to reveal identity more and more through your word as we continue this week. So, Father, would you bless their day and bless them as they go forward? And we thank you, God, for who you are and the identity you reveal to us. In your name, amen. You're welcome. We don't have time for questions, but feel free to email me, like I said before.
Maybe you can just show your email here if you're open for them writing you.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can't stop this share. So you mean like in the message box?
Yes, you can do that.
Okay. Okay, cool. Do you guys see it?
Yes. Okay, so
all right.
Michelle email is there. If you would like to ask any questions, after that you can personally email her. She can still personally attend to your email. If there's no more questions from everyone, then we will close today's section. Thank you, Michelle. Have a good rest. And we will see everyone tomorrow, same time at 9:30. So tomorrow, Michelle, you still go through First Chronicles. Is that right?
No, we are finished with First Chronicles.
Okay.
We are going to pick up with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes tomorrow.
All right. Okay, Ken. So make sure that you read books before you come to class tomorrow. Okay. All right. Okay. We will see everyone tomorrow.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Michelle.